Hi everyone. I'm going to do 2 of our weeks to catch us up on our Sunday school, and largely in part because there's a lot of repeated material in Chronicles and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel when we saw that. But also I just want to get us caught up as well. So this is for May 3rd and for May 10th. So we're going to go from 1st Chronicles chapter 1 all the way to 2nd Chronicles chapter 16. So we're going to do both of those, May 3rd and May 10th. And you don't have to do it all that much. Maybe you're already caught up, but I wanted to get us caught up. So in Chronicles, I see a bunch of lists. That's the thing I noticed when I read through this. Kind of, again, these are just observations. I didn't go too deep in everything, but just what I noticed. So a lot of lists, and I see, and I'll share my notes with you so you can see the references, but there's a list from Adam to Noah, then Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Jacob, Jacob who was also Israel to Saul, then Saul to the exile, and then the people resettled Jerusalem. And we see a lot of this where it goes all the way from the beginning to the exile and then back with some different lists. Then Saul's family, Saul's death, David's reign, and then starting 2nd Chronicles, we see Solomon's reign, we see Rehoboam's reign, Abijah's reign, and Asa's reign. And then I noticed that as he was going through these lists, making these lists, he'd take these highlights and kind of stop and talk a little bit about things, but then he'd get right back to the list. And so here are some of the highlights I noticed. The first one was the birthright. I thought that was interesting. Talked about how Reuben lost his birthright because of his sin, and then his birthright went to Joseph. And then we see this kind of he would stop and make these comments about God gives success. And we've seen this in other sections of the Bible. And of course, the tribe of Gad, God gave success to. And then David, several references to that. The Levites, Solomon, Abijah, and Asa. And then we see some of the highlights are some sins that are highlighted. And we see Manasseh, Judah and Jerusalem, Saul, and then bringing the ark back, and that specific reference to that David mentioned that they did it without the Levites the first time. That's why they had the problems there. And then, of course, David counting the fighting men. And then we see God's character kind of dispersed throughout this group of lists. And under God's character, we see he keeps his promises. He's powerful. He's just and righteous. He is loving and he's good. And he's a provider. And then leadership. We don't see the list like we do in the Kings and Samuel, but we see just a few of them here. And of course, under the bad leadership or the bad kings, we have Saul and Rehoboam. And under the good kings, we see David and Asa. Although at the very end of Asa's life, we don't see him being very consistent at the end. And we're going to talk a little bit about that toward the end here. What I noticed too is some things that were not in Chronicles that were in the King's information, like Saul's early life and David's early life. They just kind of jump right into their life, especially Saul. They just start at the very end, at his death. So Saul's early life is left out. David's early life is left out. David's sin with Bathsheba is left out. You see the reference to him in chapter 20, verse 1, that when the time for kings to go out to war, he stayed in Jerusalem, but they don't mention that at all. And that brings up a good point. Most history is written by people that are victorious, and they leave out all the bad stuff usually. It's about King so-and-so was great, did all these good things, and they never write about the bad things. But the Bible, God, he leaves the bad stuff in. So what's interesting is we see the bad stuff in the King's information, 1st, 2nd Kings. But for Chronicles, for whatever reason, they left that part out, David's sin with Bathsheba. Satan incited David to count the fighting men. We see that in 21, verses 1 to 3. What's interesting about that is the King's account talks about that an evil spirit was sent. And here we see it was Satan. So it kind of gives us more information. And this goes back to the idea of permission, that Satan has to have God's permission. Satan's not all powerful. And then Solomon's sin, that he was influenced by his foreign wives to commit idolatry. That's totally left out in the Chronicles accounts. And then the kings of Israel are barely mentioned at all. It's just basically about Judah. And the only time they're mentioned, there's just a few times, they're just kind of mentioned for context for the kings of Judah. So the focus is really on the kingdom of Judah. And then we see prayer. We see Jabez, the Reubenites, Gadites, Manasseh. We see David, Solomon, Rehoboam, and the leaders. And then we see Asa also praying. And then I noticed a lot of figures of speech in this big section. Delivered into the hands, could handle shield and sword. And what this is just kind of a downplaying. What it means is you're really good at that, but they're just saying you could use it. Same thing with could use a bow in chapter 5, verse 18, that you're really good at bow. They're just downplaying it, using the figure of speech that way. Your own flesh and blood, shepherd my people. Faces were the faces of lions, swift as gazelles in the mountains, put to flight, like the army of God. A lot of times God describes himself as army camps. Back then you would bring tents and you'd have to travel long journeys and you'd camp out around your enemy before you go and besiege the city. So God's army camps is a reference in the Bible you see a lot. And this is saying an army like the army of God, meaning it's vast. As water breaks out, struck down the army, seek his face. Heavens rejoice, earth glad, sea glad, fields jubilant, trees of the forest sing. An expression of just this amazing, wonderful things happening, that it's like everything around you is rejoicing. That's kind of the idea. In his sight, fall at the hand or into the hands of, rose up against, swept away, sword overtake, as numerous as the stars in the sky. And I like that one. At night you can look up and see the stars, and that's God's promise to Abraham, right? And that's repeated a lot in the Bible, which is pretty cool. Days on earth like a shadow. Heavens are shut up. That's a way to say it's not going to rain, kind of in a figurative way. Rested with his ancestors. We've seen that a lot. Little finger thicker than my father's waist. And scourge with whips. I will scourge with scorpions. Again, this is Rehoboam boasting about how much more he's going to do than his dad did. To your tents, O Israel. Those are fighting words, right? We talked about, you take your tent and you go fight with, you go camp out around your enemy's city. That's kind of the idea there. Wrath poured out, and anger's kind of like that. God's used to describe that a lot, about anger being poured out. It's kind of be dumped on you all at once. Crushed before the Lord. And then I wanted to just make a couple of references here I thought was interesting. The first one is the leadership of Asa that was bad, and we see he was actually good, and it says it was good in God's sight. In fact, let me read the verses here. 2 Chronicles 14, 2 through 6, and 15, 17. Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and to obey his laws and commands. He removed the high places and incense altars in every town in Judah, and the kingdom was at peace under him. He built up the fortified cities of Judah, since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. Although he did not remove the high places from Israel, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. So again, he's a good king. God says he's a good king. What's interesting, though, is there's something that happens later in his life. 2 Chronicles 16, 7 to 12. At that time, Hanani, the seer, came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. Were not the Cushites and Libyans and a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. What's interesting is, up to this point, he'd always trusted God to deliver him and to fight for him and to fight with him, as this reference makes mention to. But up to this point, he actually sends some of the treasury from the temple, the gold and the shields, to Ben-Hadad to kind of help him fight instead of trusting in God. Notice what it says in verse 9, 2 Chronicles 16. It says, "For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." That's a great verse, that God's always looking for people who are focused and looking fully committed to him, and God's going to be there. That power is going to be there for us. But then he goes on to say, "You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war." So how did Asa respond to this rebuke from this prophet? Verse 10. Asa was angry with the seer because of this. He was so enraged that he put him in prison. So that's the whole thing about don't shoot the messenger, right? At the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. So at the end of his life, he starts turning away from God, which is interesting. The events of Asa's reign from beginning to end are written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. And then verse 12. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with disease in his feet. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness, he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from the physicians. So this is a good reminder for us that if we have served God our whole life and been faithful to him our whole life, we need to continue to do that, even at the very end of our life. It's a day-to-day thing. So this is a good reminder for all of us to stay focused on God. Then I thought this was interesting. It's not in the notes, but I wanted to put it in this last section. The reference to the city of David, and this is in 1 Chronicles 11, 4 through 7. David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. The Jebusites who lived there said to David, "You will not get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. And then verse 7, David took up his residence in the fortress after they had conquered it, and so it was called the city of David. And of course, Joab leads the battle in that. So we see how that the title became the city of David. And I thought this was interesting, the prayer of Jabez. This is one of those little highlight notes from the list that he has. And this is a pretty interesting prayer. I think it was Randy Acorn wrote a whole book about it, not a very big book, but just about this prayer, which is pretty neat. Some people look at this as kind of like a model prayer, kind of like the Lord's Prayer that Jesus kind of gave us a template. This is kind of a template of prayer that Jabez did here. So verse 9, 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 9 and 10. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother had named him Jabez, saying, "I gave birth to him in pain." Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, "Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain." And God granted his request. What's interesting about this is his name actually means being born in pain. So he started out life kind of in this negative, dark cloud kind of a thing, like a lot of people do. But notice he seeks God and he prays to God, and God turns this around. And he asks God to, make him successful. I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask God for success. God's all about success. He's about success that is godly and righteous, but he's still about success. He wants things to go well. And he asks God to do that, and we see God does this. And he asks God to be with him, and he also asked that he would be free from harm and pain, and we see God granted him his request. So it's an interesting kind of model prayer there that is pretty good. Well, we'll see you next week, and hopefully we'll be able to get into our building soon and be able to be together again. Have a great day, and God bless.